Ben, it's fantastic to have you here, and we're absolutely thrilled, as already has been said, that this picture is the subject of this year's appeal. I know, having recently watched War Paint, the ABC Australian Story documentary, that the going to Afghanistan for you was really a life-changing experience, I think has already been referred to by Her Excellency. But at the same time, I also vividly remember you saying in a discussion you had with Laura Webster, the curator of this very fine publication that goes with the show that's currently on at Griffith University, that probably like many of us, you were anti-war, and that many of the soldiers you met when you got to Afghanistan felt exactly the same. How did you make that decision to go? What was it that took you over the line that made this feel like it was something you had to do?
I actually got a phone call, and I was driving with my wife along a country road near our home. We live outside, a few hours outside of Sydney, and it was, the voice said, "This is Laura Webster from the Australian War Memorial, and we'd like you to deploy to Afghanistan." And that was how she entered the conversation. I have a very good friend, Luke Scaberis, who's a very close friend of mine, a great fellow, and used to have me talking to who I thought was Margaret Olley for up to 5 minutes. He was an incredible mimic, and I actually said, "Piss off, Luke." And Laura said, "I beg your pardon, this is Laura Webster from the Australian War Memorial." My heart literally hit the floor, and I realised that in that second I knew that there was, the answer was yes.
Yeah.
She said that you can decide, it was on a Friday morning, you can decide, we needed a decision by Monday, and if you say yes, you will deploy in 5 weeks. Most of my body of work has been exploring notions of who I am, a self-portraiture in a broader sense about who young men are in our culture. And in a way, these young men are the very extreme extension of what happens to young men in our society. And I felt more than a desire, I felt a responsibility to tell that story.
Yeah. Well, in doing that, you're joining a really, truly impressive roster of Australian artists that have gone before. People like Ivor Heel and Donald Friend and Peter Churcher and others. But I was struck when I walked into the Griffith exhibition that the first painting you see, which has got emblazoned across the sky "After Afghanistan," out of which the name of this exhibition arises, that it's Purple Moon's Transparent Might. It's a tribute to Arthur Streeton. When you got there and you saw those mountains and that purple haze, was there a feeling that there was a lot about that place, quite apart from the conflict zone that you were among, that was reminded you of Australia?
Before I answer that question, the Governor mentioned that there aren't many women in the Australian War Memorial, and I awkwardly feel that possibly women aren't so stupid as to go, and they're definitely not following young women into war.
Yeah.
And look, I have to think through that more as to why young women wouldn't go. Surprising how many artists say no to the opportunity to going. Yeah. But obviously, you also need to be fit. You need to carry 24 kilograms of body armour, a helmet, all your own gear. Yeah. No one's there to carry your gear. And I was very much dedicated to not letting anyone carry my gear. They were under a lot more pressure than I was. Yeah. But when I landed in Tarin Kot, I was struck immediately by the immense beauty of that place and the incredible purple colour that comes off those enormous ancient desert mountains that rise from Tarin Kot up 3,500 metres and ring the whole of Tarin Kot Valley, Uruzgan Valley, with not one tree in sight. So I felt that if given the same opportunity, young artists in Australia would be very engaged with making paintings about such a dramatically spectacular place. Yeah. But then you quickly realise that night, the first night that I landed in Kandahar, the base was rocketed 3 times, and I had to go through the whole rocket drill, which is actually a very terrifying experience. Yeah. And some of the young people that I was with actually make a joke of it and misbehave. But if you're there for 8 months, and some of them on 6, 7, 8 rotations of 8 months, then there's no other way to deal with it but with humour. You suddenly realise that there's this very beautiful landscape with an extremely heavy human darkness hovering over it. And that was the start of the show, and definitely my feeling that there was a big story to tell.
So you're at a base, and the base, while safe, still has incoming mortar shells, you know, that becomes, if not a nightly, then a very regular occurrence. At the same time, there's a real feeling that there's risk and there's danger for you. Obviously there's risk for everyone who's there, but you're putting your life on the line in some ways. It's not realistic to say you're not. You're there exposed to the same kind of serendipitous danger that could occur, you know, to any one of those 35,000 people on that base at that one time. But the first things you do is to take your camera out, to take your sketch pad out. You start sort of engaging with individual soldiers that you meet. How does that kind of meeting come about? How do they know who you are to kind of be able to stop what they're doing to respond to your desire to perhaps get them to, you know, just to sit to you even for a moment?
Well, it's actually just quietly only in the last few years that when asked what I do I admit that I'm an artist. And in Afghanistan, to a whole lot of young, very heavily armed men, it felt even more awkward. I think growing up in Australia, it was not a career that was accepted or embraced, even though my parents loved the art gallery. They'd never really met a real breathing artist. And Brett Whiteley died the year after I finished high school of a heroin overdose, so there was all sorts of connotations attached to that profession. So I went into Afghanistan very aware that these young men probably had just as much of a rich stereotype of me as I did have of them. I was put in navy blue uniform, and I assumed that they just wanted me to be shot at before them. And I asked them all that question, and then they thought it was pretty funny and said, yep, we can't see any other reason why you would be in navy blue, because there's nothing naturally navy blue in this whole country. But I immediately started trying to work out how to stay in the background, but to be given opportunities to meet these young, often very young people. And as it happened, a very dear old friend of mine, Nick Mitsevich, who used to be in Queensland, said to me, we were at an event and he had his big bow tie on, said to me, my brother-in-law's in the Special Forces. And for any of you who know Nick, it was just the most incongruous link I had ever heard in my life. And I said, I just don't believe you, Nick. And he said, no, really, he'll be in Afghanistan when you're there, and here's a phone number. And it was as simple as that. I contacted Trooper Captain S when I got there. Shane Mackay is Nick's brother-in-law when I got there, and he gave me really unfettered access to the whole of the base. Saying that, the first night that I arrived there and met Shane, I said, I'd really like to get some of you people together tomorrow morning. And he said, no worries, I'll put it out through my formal channels and I'll tell them what you're doing. By then, I think he'd seen that I had his best interests at heart, and I wanted to know the truth about the situation and the real truth of what the circumstance that they were in. And he put it out, and the next morning one young fellow showed up at the meeting point at 9 o'clock in the mess. And I said, thanks very much for coming. Are you interested in art? He said, I was ordered to come. So that wasn't the best start, but that was only day 2 of Tarancot. And after a week, I had a lot of friends, and they trusted me. I think they felt like I was one of them in a sense. And very profound experiences of having these guys. Captain S, Shane, had served 7 deployments, 6 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. And he not once did he make me feel that I was in the way. I was completely unarmed. And one of the things that I promised my wife is that I would not go in a Bushmaster. I thought that's where the real danger was, and I promised her I wouldn't do it. And not once did they make me feel that I was not standing up and being a part of it.
So going into Afghanistan, because you'd obviously have those weeks thinking about how I was going to do this and how I was going to engage with the service personnel that were there. Did you think initially it would be making and taking sketches and taking them out and then working up portraits in the studio? Did you actually think ahead that I need to get these guys back, or was that something that came later?
I really had no idea. I'd never been there. As I said, I had such a thick stereotype of what these people would be like. My experience of war was my uncle who went to Vietnam, who we grew up never, just knowing that we could never talk to him about his experience there. Yeah. So I had no experience and I didn't know what I was going into. So I took everything, cameras and a computer, lots of drawing materials, as much as I could carry, and I just started working and trying to fit it in between getting them into a quiet part of the base, a safe, quiet part in the sun was a good thing to do, and then talking to them, and they all want to talk, they all want to tell you what, once they trust that I have their best interests at heart, they wanted to tell the story of what they were witnessing. And I was also very different. I smashed their stereotype as much as they smashed mine. I think one funny moment, I at one point I thought I do want to see this landscape before I go home. And one young fellow who was working in the special operations base was having 20 coffees a day in 5 shots of 4 coffees. And so he was quite jittery a lot of the time, but an amazing young man, fabulous young fellow, and that was part of his coping mechanism. And I said, take me to the most beautiful part of the base, and he took me up onto this very, very spectacularly beautiful part of the base. But he just didn't stop moving. I started getting out my materials, and he was around behind me and circling around and jittery and armed. And I said, do you want to sit down? He said, no. And I said, I started trying to work, and then finally it was just impossible to work because I had this constant human being walking around. I said, why won't you sit down? He said, oh, no one ever sits still this long in this place. We're well within the range of a Russian rifle, and you have never seen an artist pack up so quick.
So, okay, you pack up under haste. All of that material that you produce there, the photographs and the drawings and sketches and so on, you get that back home, you're in the studio. What happens? How hard is it to get from that point of capturing this kind of raw, visceral data that you're getting out of the field, and then you're in the peace and quiet of a northern New South Wales rural town, no shots being fired, no danger. How do you get that unpacked into a painting like this?
I made 2 or 3 good paintings that are in the show that I like very much, but then I felt like the truth had walked out the door, so I invited all of my subjects to come to Robertson, to the town that I'm in, and to come to my studio and spend a day or two. And very early on I realised that they needed to be naked, which is quite a difficult thing. My wife said to me, I was always worried that you'd have naked women in your studio. I'd be more worried about the naked men. But very big, strong young men who've just walked back in to country from Afghanistan are on an incredible high, which I'm sure Tim and some of you here would know about. Incredible high that they've come home, that they've survived, and they would do anything for me at that point. And the first night I asked, actually, Nick's brother-in-law, will you do this for me? This is my idea. Before I had even finished the sentence, he was unbuttoning his shirt. I said, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. But I felt that to show the real story, they'd told me enough in Afghanistan of their fears, and a lot of them had asked me to photograph them in uniform in Afghanistan, and I didn't realise why until I got home. Someone at the War Memorial said, because if they're killed, they'd like an up-to-date photograph for their families.
Cool. There's absolutely no question that without a strong empathetic response to their plight and their predicament, you could not produce work like this. And what's interesting, reading the accounts in the catalogue, in particular, if I could just quote from this extraordinary man who gave a wonderful speech about the context of this exhibition when it was opened here at Griffith. I didn't have the privilege of hearing it, but I've heard so many reports about it. This is Air Commodore John Oddie, who's a subject of 3 of the paintings in the exhibition, and he made, I thought, what was as revealing a statement as I think you've created a revealing image of he and other men and women in your suite of paintings. He said, either through a lack of insight or through unwillingness, I wasn't always admitting the truth to myself about my life. Ben really took that out and put it on the table in front of me, a bit like a 3-course dinner. And he said, well, how about that? And you know, I sort of thought, well, I'm not going to come back to this restaurant in a hurry. And I thought that absolutely synthesised what must have been a quite profound degree of understanding that you'd developed for the soldiers with whom you were working, and that they in turn had responded very generously to you. Just the sheer fact they were prepared to pose naked without any constraint in your studio speaks of that. But without all of that openness and honesty between subject and painter, I simply don't think you would have created paintings on the scale and of the depth that you have done through this exhibition.
Yeah, it's a good question. At one point, someone in defence suggested that I'd been looking for people who had emotional weakness. Oh. And I wanted them to be put in touch with someone like Shane Mackay, who's a seven tour veteran, who also happens to babysit my kids. So, and they climb all over him. And there's a few of them. There's 3 young fellows who have babysat my kids, who are also trained to kill. Really, yeah. That's what their training is. Yeah, they're my friends.
Yeah, yeah. It's very clear, and seeing that documentary too, that the way they spoke about, they reacted to you, that was very clearly a trust and a strong and genuine relationship that was established between both of you. When I first saw this exhibition, I hadn't seen a great deal of your work before looking at the exhibition at Griffith University. It was the kind of exhibition that I found myself very deeply moved by.
I find it hard to look at.
Yeah, I can understand why painting work of this kind must be exhausting, emotionally exhausting for any artist. And I think back in terms of the sort of art historical origins of your practice. I know that much has been made in previous commentary that people like the British modernist Frank Auerbach have been a very strong influence on your practice. But I look at this and I look at other works up at Griffith and I think immediately of Chaim Soutine, of which we happen to have a very remarkably good painting in this collection. But Soutine almost seemed to paint in a way that put pressure on his subjects, that really responded in a very incisive way to the character and nature of the sitter or the subject. It was often, a dead chook or a piece of meat. It was a still life often as much as it was a portrait. But the way in which paint was applied drove home the point that he was drawing out almost as if through psychic release somehow this insight into the sitter, which was beyond that which I think the sitter probably was ever prepared to give to him. And I feel that with these paintings, you've drawn something of that same psychological dimension of your sitters out over and above the physical dimension that clearly sits there on the canvas.
It's a good point. Soutine's an incredible painter and a real painter's painter. But these fellows came to me with that weight, with the intense emotional trauma. And none of them had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder when I met them all. Since then, now 5 are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder out of 11 people. In fact, only 4, and 1, I'm sure, is suffering and won't be diagnosed. One of the young fellows, in fact the youngest, has attempted suicide twice since I met him, and he was 19 years old when I met him. So in some ways, the trauma, as I worked, unveiled itself. And in some ways, the experience of having seen that, for me, was more confronting than being in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, look, just in closing, I think you've given Australia and these Australian servicemen and women a remarkable gift of insight into the conditions that they endure and the experiences that they've taken out of that theatre of war. And for most of us, we're very fortunate that it's not an experience that we have. But it's incredibly important that we understand the impact that it has on these young lives. And I think that the Australian War Memorial chose well. And I'm very proud that this is a picture that hopefully with the support of the public of Queensland, that we can see eventually come into the collections of the Queensland Art Gallery. I'm confident it will. It's the kind of painting, I think, that drives home so many great stories and so many accounts and experiences of life in a war zone. And as Tim was saying, wouldn't it be good if indeed we didn't need official war artists anymore? But on that note, I want to thank you so very much for the time you've given to us tonight, for the openness with which you've responded to these questions. And I know that we've all really appreciated having you here, as we will appreciate in the future having this picture here.
One quick other thing I thought I should just say. Some years ago I had a big painting that I actually felt I've shown more in Brisbane than any other city, and for a long time, and I thought I should give it to the museum here. And Margaret Ollie said, "Don't you dare give it to them until they buy something."
Thank you. Well, on that note, we're all here to buy something. FPOS. It's been fantastic. Thank you again, Ben, but also thank you, all of you, for coming out in such large numbers tonight. We're absolutely thrilled with the response that we've had to the appeal to date, and I feel sure that we'll be excited with the reaction that we get to tonight's appeal launch. I do hope that you'll support the appeal, and you can easily do so online or at the desk across the way. And can I also just take this final opportunity to very warmly thank Her Excellency, and also to thank Tim for their generous remarks in introducing the evening. Thank you as well to Yearing Station, who are our indefatigable wine sponsor. We love you. And for all of that, I do hope that all of you who are here tonight looking at this picture and thinking about and reflecting upon what this work might mean, you put it even into a deeper, richer context by going to the Griffith University Art Gallery. The exhibition is open till the 7th of June. I heartily commend it to you, and I thank you for coming.